Bill Gates is a really interesting figure because it's like he's the one billionaire who's not really out in front with the money, not trying to go to the moon, bless him, or excuse me, not trying to go to space, and yet still building this small, nonprofit empire. Tell us, about you. I know this is basically an in-depth investigative look at the Gates Foundation, a $67 billion endowment, larger than most countries' GDPs. What should people know about Bill Gates and about his foundation, just sort of broadly?
It's the largest private foundation in the world, basically the largest charity. It's handed out billions of dollars a year. It has a great deal of influence over all kinds of public policy. In the United States, the Gates Foundation plays a heavy role in influencing U.S. education. Abroad, the Gates Foundation works on everything, public health and everything within public health, agricultural development, contraceptive access, financial systems. So it really plays, the way that I write the book is I describe the Gates Foundation not as a charity, but as a political organization. It's a tool that Bill Gates uses to advance his worldview. He's not donating money as much as he's buying influence.
And here's the question, because I think a lot of libs will basically be like, but his worldview is good, vaccines, contraception. Those are generally liberal things, maybe. So what's the harm? He's helping. What would you say to that, or what don't they understand?
Yeah, and I think this is part of Bill Gates' good billionaire chic, or this patina of being a good billionaire. We've had how many investigative reports and books about the Koch brothers because their politics don't clearly align or don't shine with sort of a mainstream neoliberal ideology.
Right.
Whereas Bill Gates, they do. You think about the presidents who have been in power, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. He was very much been a man of his times, politically speaking. The ideas that he has about market-based solutions, the primacy of the private sector, technological innovation as a solution to everything. So that's really helped him with his political agenda. Remind me your question.
No, that so long, what's the harm of a foundation being this big and offering this many arguably very life-saving critical services? Again, vaccines, contraception. What did you find out in terms of the amount of power and pull, and how can that be problematic?
So, in a general sense, it's a problem because it's anti-democratic. It's the richest guy gets the loudest voice. Bill Gates has all this money, so he can start donating and pulling levers. In a more specific sense, to the core of your question, the Gates Foundation's interventions aren't working, and they're often doing more harm than good. So today, Gates promised a revolution in African agriculture, that he was going to cut hunger in half and double yields. And that hasn't, not only has that not delivered, but independent researchers show that agriculture in some respects is actually going backwards. You have farmer groups across Africa today who are openly, explicitly calling on the Gates Foundation to end its charitable crusades because they're doing more harm than good. And it's the same story you find over and over. If you look at their work in U.S. education, it's been a real failure. The Gates, however, Bill and Melinda French Gates, they operate with this hubris, this belief that their great wealth entitles them to keep throwing the dart.
Right.
Collateral damage be damned, opportunity cost be damned, that they are, right and righteous in everything they do. And so that justifies the power that they wield.
Okay, can I ask you about what is his involvement with government? Are these government contracts? Is he supplanting government programs to say, on top of the fact that a lot of this is a massive tax write-off and a tax break for his billions of wealth? So just maybe those are two separate things, but in terms of how much taxes he's actually skimping and getting away with not paying because of the foundation, and then what are the contracts and what kinds of ins does he have with governments around the world?
Yeah, so the taxes is an important issue because at the end of the day, the Gates Foundation is spending our money. Massive billions of dollars in tax subsidies and tax benefits are flowing into Gates's charitable projects. So, that's a real easy trigger to say, if Gates is spending our money, we should have some say in how it's spent. We should have basic transparency to be able to follow the money. We should have checks and balances. But the other thing that the Gates Foundation does is it creates these massive public-private partnerships where the Gates Foundation will create an organization, take a board seat, put its allies and surrogates on the rest of the board. And then it goes around. Bill and Melinda often personally would go around to government leaders all over the world, pressuring them to donate billions of dollars to help fund these public-private partnerships. So, I mean, in terms of, I mean, it's effectively acting out often essentially as a lobbyist in a lot of places where they can, especially if you can go into a poor nation where the Gates Foundation can show up with essentially a suitcase full of money and start putting their hands on the levers of public policy to shape what the world looks like for poor people.
And what are the strings attached to things like that when the government, and is there an example, like when a government does sort of, engage and work with the Gates Foundation, is it like, are we talking, well, we must, remake this, you got to do a cash crop instead of, regenerative farming, or, in the ways that like other corporations or even international institutions, IMF, World Bank, will put, stipulations on any kind of money or funding for countries?
Yeah, I mean, when the foundation makes a donation, it's not simply writing a check, it's also sending along a checklist of things to do. So the Gates Foundation internally has set its own priorities and agenda, and it's calling on other organizations to do the work to execute that agenda and priorities. If you follow the checklist, you tick the boxes, more money will flow. Yeah, I mean, probably the best example was the foundation's work in the pandemic, where Bill Gates parlayed his decades of work with vaccines. He had a network, he knew the pharmaceutical companies, and he helped create a massive response effort that was supposed to deliver vaccines to the global poor. He promised it would deliver vaccine equity, but instead it presided over vaccine apartheid. The poorest, most vulnerable people went to the back of the line, while the rest of us in rich nations were able to get our vaccines. And the problem was the Gates approach, which was that he thought he could work with and through the pharmaceutical companies to create this massive, complex humanitarian procurement and distribution mechanism. And at the beginning of the pandemic, public health experts all over the world said this is not going to work. The pharmaceutical industry, of course, is trying to make money. They're going to prioritize sales to the highest bidders in the richest nations, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And
Sorry. I mean, exactly. It's where the whole, like, I believe in the private sector to like deliver, for everyone fucking fell apart, and everybody saw that. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, just that there was another option on the table. The idea of a people's vaccine, of waiving the patents, of challenging big pharma, of compelling the pharmaceutical industry to share its vaccine technology, to get every manufacturing facility everywhere in the world up and running and churning out vaccines at maximum capacity. And Bill Gates, in many ways, was a chief obstacle to that because he was there on the nightly news talking about how patents aren't important, how he's got this, how his project is going to deliver vaccine equity. So, the Gates Foundation loves to talk about the lives it's saving through its work doing things like delivering vaccines. And it's true, vaccines are vitally important. Vaccines save lives. But the way the foundation is doing it is delivering vaccines. It's the most inefficient and unjust way that you could imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about exactly how it works, because I do think that ultimately what the COVID-19 pandemic proved is, that, you can't leave it up to these benevolent billionaires or so-called benevolent billionaires, and that government does have a role to play. But if you've undermined government for years and years and years and say any regulation on pharmaceutical companies is amount to socialism and it's going to stifle innovation, even though we've got a lot of money from the government itself to do this research, it's like, yeah, no, sorry, Bill Gates, like there's limits to even what you can do. You're not going to, out of the goodness, they're not going to be like, oh, Pfizer's going to be like, okay, we'll just give the vaccine away for free. Only governments could stipulate that. They didn't, let's be clear, but they could have and still could maybe.
Yeah, and that's what made Bill Gates so powerful during the pandemic, was there was a real vacuum of leadership from many other global leaders. So Gates showed up early, he was talking fast, he had big ideas, and everyone just kind of went with his plan. But to your point, yeah, the next time the pandemic comes, the last or one of the last people we should listen to is Bill Gates.
Yeah, so crazy right-wingers, maybe they're right about something. I think it's very funny that Gates is sort of like, stirred the ire of the far right. I mean, it's not funny. It's also very scary, which is why sort of a knee-jerk response from a lot of liberals is to defend Gates at all costs, right? Because he's being attacked by anti-vax right-wingers. And it's like, no, maybe we shouldn't necessarily. But Dina, I'm curious, you did feel Windows XP sort of upload, I'm assuming when you got your vaccine and booster.
Yeah, how's that implant sitting with you?
Yeah,
The
exactly.
microchip.
This is my way of saying,
all
yeah.
right?
I mean, I do think it is interesting because it's like Bill Gates, he gets to fly under the radar because it's under the guise of like actually helping, right? And yet I think it's abdicating a responsibility that governments around the world, including the United States government, has. But we learn now about how much like access Elon Musk has, to like even the security state here, and Bill Gates also has that same amount of access to, State Department officials, I'm assuming. But like, what did you learn? Like politically, is it buying influence or is it just kind of like, let Bill do it?
No, it's definitely by influence. One of the things I did in my reporting was try to follow the money. Where is the Gates Foundation actually spending its money? If you go to this website, it's larded with these images of Black and brown women and children smiling. These are the people, the intended beneficiaries of the Gates Foundation. If you follow the money, it's all going to Washington, D.C. and Geneva. Not all of it, but the vast majority, like 90% of the foundation's money is going to the United States and Europe. So the Gates model is helping the rich help the poor. And one of the two largest destinations are Washington, D.C. and Geneva, and those are its two seats of power. Washington, D.C., the Gates Foundation has a great deal of influence. It's meeting with Congress all the time. And this is what, so much of the foundation's empire runs on public funds, on getting donor governments from rich nations to put money into these public-private partnerships. So that's why the foundation puts so much energy and attention into a place like Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. Even if they're not actually like bearing results or like, anything, it's ultimately still that tax write-off. And it's still money for their coffers. They don't have to prove that what they're doing is actually effective or working. I guess my question is also like, what's the end goal? Like, what is it low taxes again? Is it not breaking up? I mean, I guess there was already sort of a, massive settlement around Microsoft. Like what does he want? Ultimately, I think a lot of this is a question like, but what does this billionaire want? Is it actually just continuing to be part of the 1% in power and influence? Is there a presidential run? Like, what have you seen?
I mean, I believe that Bill Gates believes that he's really helping the world.
Okay.
So, I mean, I would say, I don't know if you could call that well-meaning or not. I mean, the problem is he just has so much hubris. That he's not actually helping the world, and he's helping the world the only way he knows how, which is by taking control of other people's problems and insisting that he has the right solution. So people have kind of forgotten that Bill Gates' first chapter running Microsoft, where he was this embattled tech billionaire monopolist, and he very quickly reformed that reputation by becoming this philanthropist.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fairy tale, it's a fiction, but this idea that he's now giving away all of his money, he's generous where he was once greedy, he's kind-hearted where he was cold-hearted.
Right. He's post-Scrooge.
Yeah, right. But then you look at his bank account and his personal wealth has almost doubled during his tenure as a philanthropist. The guy today is worth $115 billion. He is a totem and an emblem of inequality. He's not a driver of social progress.
Yeah, and amassing amounts of power, throughout the world, like through the foundation is pretty dangerous, and it's also, like you're saying, undemocratic, and it's also incredibly like paternalistic and hierarchical and top down, and it's just like, again, also like whatever Western white savior complex coming in. It's not as if folks don't have the tools. It's like you could still just give the money, zero strings attached, and or like, empower, help, just give the money to the government or lobby your own government to or corporations to stop, impoverishing and keeping other nations, sort of at that bottom of the totem pole, blah blah. But I guess lastly, I want to ask about the you have chapters about women and family planning, I guess, throughout Africa and sort of Gates Foundation's role in that. Why is that sort of insidious? Like, what is sort of the maybe the like scarier, darker side to offering contraception or family planning, things that like even George W. Bush was against, right? And that the right we know is virulently against.
Yeah, this is a very difficult chapter to write because this whole book, I'm dealing with issues like contraceptives and vaccines. Obviously, I think these are important, essential. And so you have to get very nuanced in describing what the problem is. So the Gates Foundations, or the ideals of the movement of family planning, are really about empowering women to make choices for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just helping poor women have smaller families.
Mm-hmm.
That if that is the kernel of your approach to family planning, that really harkens back to the dark history of population control and eugenics, where it's about, helping or compelling poor women to have smaller families.
Right.
So the Gates Foundation operates in one direction. If poor women have terrible problems with infertility, I mean, the infertility is a problem in poor nations like it is everywhere else.
Right.
The Gates Foundation could be putting money into that. It's not. Instead, it's very narrowly looking at helping poor women have smaller families, and even more narrow than that, through specific kinds of contraceptives that it endorses, that it helps subsidize, working with the pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
So,
so we have to make Yaz rich in the Congo.
yeah, I mean, it's not to say that women have not benefited. Women and other users have not benefited from the contraceptives the Gates Foundation has made available at times. Of course they have. But, this idea of family planning, the ideals of it, it's not a privilege to have access to contraceptive that is organized and curtailed by a billionaire in Seattle. We need to be thinking about this more as a human right.
Yeah.
And what happens when Bill Gates dies? What happens when Bill Gates changes his mind? When Melinda French Gates leaves the Gates Foundation? You don't want the priorities, or you don't want access to contraceptives to be subject to these vicissitudes.
Of course. And also, I think that generally, as we talk about reproductive rights and reproductive justice, it's like, I think about Liz Winstead, who's been on the show multiple times, who talks about like supporting all pregnancy outcomes is really about what like reproductive liberation is, and what choice actually is yes, if you want to have multiple kids, or like that, they will live prosperous lives, they will have healthcare, that they will be taken care of, that they will have some semblance of dignity, and not just here's some Yaz or whatnot. I don't know why I'm focused on Yaz, but I think it'd be very funny if Bill Gates is pushing it. Finally, you're gonna have to do the media rounds with your book, which is great, but it's also, you have to break through this, again, liberal veneer that Bill Gates is a savior, that he's doing good. Why are you coming after him? At least he's not Elon Musk, at least he's not Bezos. What is like the media landscape look like for, like sort of, cracking, like busting the myth about Bill Gates, and how has he kind of like played the media to make himself look very good?
Well, this is a dark story because the Gates Foundation is donating hundreds of millions of dollars to the news media. So
just donating, just like, here you go.
Yeah. Well, it's not only that, but there's strings attached. It's like, we want you to use this money to report on topics that the Gates Foundation also works on. Right. So suddenly journalists are writing stories about topics Gates works on, talking to sources funded by Gates. It's this level of epistemic control, its ability to shape or own its own narrative. So it is difficult. The reception of the book so far has been good. That doesn't mean that large swaths of the news media have perverse incentives to challenge the book, criticize the book.
Sure.
It doesn't. Yeah, there's a lot of news outlets that aren't. As a journalist, the target of your investigation can't also be your funder. And too often that's the case with the Gates Foundation. One thing I say in the book is that news outlets should stop taking funding from the Gates Foundation, because there's too many examples where it's introducing bias, where it's hurting the integrity and the independence of the news media.
Well, PBS takes it from both Koch and Gates, I feel like. So
they
balance out.
Because those are the only two perspectives, right?
No, exactly. I mean, that's why I've always said we need to run a third party billionaire
That's a
in the
good
media,
idea.
and just we need. So I mean, that's my theory of social change: is really first become billionaire, then donate to your causes, then revolution over. Like that's I don't know if you listen to the show, but that's mostly what I advocate for: is just getting really rich.
So let's make a pact. Whoever becomes a billionaire first will
Let's
support the
go.
other. All
Let's
right.
go.
Why is he buying all the farmland? It spooks me. What's he doing there?
I think there's a point where you have so much money. I mean, you just got to acquire things. I mean, I do think he probably, I don't know if he's hedging his bets. What's your theory? I don't know.
Oh, you don't even have a theory. You're just like, sorry, Dina, what's your theory?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I always go to conspiracy zone. Maybe there's going to be a food supply crisis and he wants to be the one to have the monopoly on it.
Well, I mean, I do think he is like financially planning. He is organizing his finances in a careful and safe and cautious way, and probably is positioned to profit in certain ways if things go one way or the other. But I would take a less conspiratorial, more innocent view. It's just that,
No,
he's
thanks.
got okay.
Pass. Yeah, I mean, I think another, like, obviously we've seen, I did this where I did this story about billionaires building like bunkers in grain silos. So there's always that. But yeah, I mean, like, and this is the thing. It's like maybe there will be micro grants to farmers to like go back, keep on working it. But like, that should be an effort that comes from the government. It shouldn't be an effort that comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But again, the hubris, like you're saying, Tim, and the sort of like egomaniacal, like pet projects that these billionaires have and can play around with, make it so it's not that they're like, oh, I'll jumpstart the program and then I will, hand it off to the US government. I will hand it off to local government in whatever, Iowa or wherever the hell. Like, no, it's about him. It's about self-aggrandizement and and again, a tax write-off as well. But anywho, good question, Dean. Anything else, Dina, before we move on?
Just one quick last thing. Do you think it's harder for like the Epsteins and the Maxwells of the world to blackmail a guy like him because he doesn't seem particularly sexual? Is it like instead of like getting like like instead of offering him young girls, it's like a room full of cats that he can strangle? That seems like more his vibe.
Well, you haven't been following the news cycle, Dina. He's actually gotten in quite a bit of, there's quite a few allegations surrounding his alleged philandering, which he, inappropriate relationship towards female subordinates at Microsoft and the Gates Foundation, which Gates denies. He reached the absolute zenith of his career when he was the COVID pandemic sort of czar. And then he got divorced from Melinda, all of his allegations of misconduct, which Gates denies. Weird relationship, hard to explain relationship with Jeffrey Epstein.
Okay, yeah, let's just be real. Was it on PBS, I think, actually, interestingly, where he had that really ominous answer where he was like, well, you know a lot of powerful people, you might just have to be careful. I don't know why he like had it clasped his hands like this. And he said, like, what's the quote where he goes, Tim, remember it for me. He's like, you just want to be careful. And this is after Epstein, in air quotes, dies.
Yeah, he said something like, he said, well, look at Epstein, he's dead. He said something kind of very cryptic like that. And his eyes are like clearly darting to his handlers who were like, no.
He did not have a good answer to that. That was so ominous and scary.
I mean, the problem with that interview is, like you said, is the Gates Foundation funds PBS. So they did ask the question.
Right.
He probably knew the question was coming. But what you need to do, if you're really being a hard journalist, is you follow up. He didn't answer the question. You ask it again. You ask it again until he answers the question.
Right. Well, he's dead now.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.